Jazz. So one of the most interesting sort of mini chord progressions that you'll come across is a 1, 2, 3 dominant progression. And it's used in songs like All of Me, Someday My Prince Will Come, and On the Sunny Side of the Street. Now it sounds great, but why does it sound great? At first glance, it doesn't really look like it should work. So this progression can be analysed in a number of different ways. First, it can be analysed as a tonic chord substitute. I've covered in other lessons that in order for one chord to substitute for another chord, it needs to contain the original chord's guide tones, so the third and the seventh of the original chord. So if we take C major 7 as our one chord, we have the notes C, E, G, and B. So E and B are our guide tones. Now the 3 dominant chord is an E7, and it contains the notes E, G sharp, B, and D. So it's got that E and B in there. It's got the guide tones of the original chord, the C major 7, in this chord. So it can be a substitute for the C major 7. And specifically, this would be a rootless C major 9, sharp 5, but rootless as I said. Second, it can also be analysed as a dominant chord substitution. Now, if we take the dominant chord in the key of C, we have a G7. Now, a common chord substitution of this chord is a diminished substitution, which would give us a G sharp diminished 7. And again, it works because the G sharp diminished 7 contains the guide tones of G7, namely B and F. But a diminished chord is symmetrical. That is, every inversion of this diminished chord is another diminished chord. So we have G sharp diminished, B diminished, D diminished, and F diminished. And every diminished chord is a substitution for a dominant chord. That is, this G sharp diminished chord is a substitution for a G7, a B flat 7, a D flat 7, and an E7. This means that these 4 dominant chords are related to each other through this diminished chord. And you'll notice that the G7 and the D flat 7 are tritone substitutions of each other. So then we can expand this idea of tritone substitution and say that dominant chords a minor third apart can substitute for each other. And you'll notice that the E7 is in there as well. So an E7 can be used as a substitute for a G7. So looking at the notes in the chord E7, from the point of view of the chord G7, we find that we have a 13, flat 9, 3, and 5. So there's no 7th, which isn't ideal, but it can still work. Again, because of this related diminished chord idea. And finally, a 3 dominant chord can act as a 5 chord, taking us to the relative minor. So in our case, we would expect this chord progression to go from C major 7 to E7 to A minor 7. So the E7 can be a 5 chord going to the 1 chord of the A minor 7. So we've modulated to the key of A minor, and this is a prepared modulation because we're going 5, 1. Or it can be a secondary dominant, so a 5 of 6. And then continuing on with a chord progression in the key of C. And generally, when you're looking at jazz standards, a 3 dominant chord will act as a primary or secondary dominant, taking us to that 6 chord or the relative minor key. Or perhaps the substitution of the 6 chord, so the A minor 7 chord, like the 4 chord, the F major 7 chord, which would just be a median note substitution of the chord A minor 7. So as you can see, a 1, 2, 3 dominant progression can be analysed in a number of different ways. And this is the reason why this particular series of chords sounds so interesting and so good. It's precisely because it's so ambiguous. It could be a tonic chord or a dominant chord in the major key or the relative minor key. And this ambiguity is what makes this chord sound really interesting and really curious. Cool, and that's it for this lesson, a nice short one. Thanks for watching, guys. See ya.